everybody. We are back with another WNBA update. We've got a jam-packed week to recap that was in the W. We have the Commissioner's Cup. Caitlin Clark is still sidelined with a groin injury, plus a little bit of drama going on with the WNBA expansion and so much more. So let's get into it. Starting with the Fast Five. The Fast Five things that you may have missed this past week in the WNBA. Starting off with number one, the Indiana Fever are your 2025 WNBA Commissioner's Cup champions, and it did not come with at least a little bit of stress in the first half. The Minnesota Lynx came out with a commanding lead. Then in the second quarter, the Indiana Fever were able to retake the lead, and they held the Lynx to 0 goose egg, big nada points in the last 8 minutes of the second quarter. They defeated the number one team in the league, the Minnesota Lynx, at home at the Target Center, 74-59 for the Fever's first ever Commissioner's Cup win. Now, we've seen a trend over the last couple of years in the WNBA that the teams that are represented in the Commissioner's Cup and the teams that win the Commissioner's Cup will also find themselves in the WNBA Finals. So will this year continue that trend or not? We shall see. So let's move on to number two. The WNBA announced 3 new expansion teams. So the W is headed to Detroit, Philadelphia, and Cleveland all throughout the next 5 years. And of course, don't forget, next year we will be adding Toronto and Portland to the WNBA as well. So 5 new teams in the next 5 years and 6 new teams in the last 6 years if you count the Golden State Valkyries. Let's move on to number 3. Caitlin Clark missed her 5th straight game. That's her 9th game that she's missed this entire season, going back to the beginning of the season when she was out with a quad injury. She's missed the last 5 games with a groin injury. 9 games, that's 50% of the season. The Fever are 18 games into their 2025 season. So the Fever have held their own mostly over the last 5 games. They're 3-2 in those last 5 games, including a Commissioner's Cup championship over the number one team in the league. But for how long can the Fever hold on to a playoff spot without Caitlin Clark with some uncertainty about her injury? We'll get into all of that on today's edition of the show. Moving on to number 4, Angel Reese's Twitter fingers are Twitter fingering because she was calling out the refs. She responded to a photo of her getting fouled at the rim saying diabolical. She told the refs that, quote, IDGAF, and that the WNBA needs to do better. She didn't even care about getting a fine. She wanted to call out the refs on Twitter. So what will come of that? We shall see. Moving on to number 5, the Aces got blown out by the Indiana Fever without Caitlin Clark, 81-54. The Aces and Becky Hammon, their head coach, have struggled all season. It's been hot and cold and good and not so good. Is it the defense? Is it work ethic like their head coach Becky Hammon has called out in the past? Will this brutal loss be a turning point for the Aces, or is this just what the Aces are this year? We'll get into that on today's edition of the program as well. That was this week's Fast Five, everything that you missed this past week in the WNBA. It is game time, so let's start off with the first quarter. Caroline Fenton, Cassandra Negley, of course, hanging out with you. Caitlin Clark's injury woes continue. So, Cass, at this point in the season, Caitlin Clark has missed 9 games total. Initially, it was 4 games earlier in the season with a quad injury. She's been sidelined for the past 5 games with a groin injury, including the Commissioner's Cup. And look, the Fever have been able to go 3-2 in that 5-game stretch that she's most recently been out. They were able to come back and beat the Lynx in the Commissioner's Cup. It was a crazy comeback win. They were able to absolutely dominate the Aces, and then they turn around with a loss against the Sparks. So it's been up, it's been down, and we have seen clearly the Fever are able to piece together winning basketball without Caitlin Clark, but they're not able, at least, to do it on a consistent basis. Let's start with the Caitlin Clark injury news of things. What is the latest that you've heard on Caitlin Clark's injury? Have you heard any updates? And what can we expect from CC moving forward?
It's really been the same thing from Stephanie White that it has been all year, including that first injury stretch. basically sounds day to day. They're going to take it as it comes, and they are very, very focused on not running her back too early. Steph White talked this week about Caitlin has made no secret she doesn't like minutes restrictions. So the training staff and Steph White are looking at it as if, she's cleared to play, but we feel as though she needs to be on a minutes restriction, maybe we save her. I think at this point, it's kind of interesting to think, do they maybe just hold her until All-Star weekend? Do they maybe target that game in Boston against the Sun as kind of like a slight welcome back game for the game the next night against the Liberty? Or do they just skip the Sun and bring her back for the Liberty because that's a back-to-back? I don't know.
And all of Stephanie White's comments have been incredibly vague. And I would assume that's by design. Just like you said, she said, hey, if there's going to be a minutes restriction, we're not going to play her. If she can come back, then great. We're going to hold her out until she's 100%. So, yes, it's an injury update, I guess, in a way, but it's still incredibly vague and still doesn't really give us a peek behind the curtain of exactly what's going on with Caitlin Clark's rehab behind the scenes. So TBD, at least today, Monday, July 7th, as we're recording this podcast, just kind of vague updates on Caitlin Clark, but that brings up an even larger question about the Fever and the rest of their season, potentially the postseason, that, yes, they beat the Lynx, the number one team in the WNBA, in their own house, in the Commissioner's Cup, when the Lynx were riding a double-digit lead in the first quarter. They were able to come back. They shut the Lynx out in the last 8 minutes of the first half. They came alive offensively. The Fever are able to piece things together to win games without Caitlin Clark. Kelsey Mitchell stepping up big. Lexi Hull stepping up big. This team can win games without Caitlin Clark. Obviously, they are better with Caitlin Clark. Let's just state that for the record. But can they do this consistently without her?
I think that's been the problem, right? They are so inconsistent. Heading into that Commissioner's Cup game, Sydney Colson told us that she told the team, this has to be the turning point in the season. And I think for the entire team, it was an opportunity to get a whole bunch of money, but also show that they can be a consistent team, a solid defensive team, which I think they showed. They can piece it together on offense, find the open person, kind of deal with pressures that aren't there when Caitlin's on the floor. But obviously that letdown against the Sparks was problematic. And I think the thing that will really help them when Caitlin is back is that ability late in tight games when you've just been clawing for a lead. I think she's the person who is a clutch player and can maybe settle them, run a certain play to get them into an action that will seal the game. But so far, they've been super inconsistent, and I wonder if we will look back at that Commissioner's Cup win and say it was a turning point or it was just another point of an inconsistent year.
I kind of feel two ways about it. And I know that that's not the way that you're allowed to be in sports talk. You have to have an opinion. You have to feel very hot takey about it. But I think two things can be true at once. You can look at what the Fever did in the Commissioner's Cup and say that team plus Caitlin Clark, if and when she comes back 100% healthy, that's a championship contender. That's a team that can beat anybody in this league. And then you also look at the performance against the Sparks. You also look at a couple weeks ago against the Valkyries when they simply could not get a bucket. And that was with Caitlin Clark. And you think, okay, well, we've seen the highest of highs of this team and the potential of this team with and without Caitlin Clark. And then we've also seen the lows of this team, which are, of course, I think something that the Fever identified early in the season as they were building this team. They brought in a DeWanna Bonner, a veteran, a certified winner, somebody that knows how to win basketball games. Obviously, no DeWanna Bonner. She was waived just a couple of weeks ago. So they're still a young team. They're still a team that doesn't have a whole lot of, championship winning experience. They're a team that's still figuring out how to win. They just need to do that on a more consistent basis, and they need more consistency from Caitlin Clark's availability. The best ability in sports is your availability, and the truth and the fact of the matter is Caitlin Clark has not been available. But as Stephanie White said, they're holding her out until she's 100%. And when you're looking at longevity and when you're looking at a championship ultimately being your ultimate goal, which it should be, that is the Fever's ultimate goal. You want 100% Caitlin Clark in the playoffs and in the postseason. It's just in the right now, that's a massive question mark and a kind of a dark gray cloud hanging over this Fever team that's been able to accomplish a lot as of late.
Not to mention that when Caitlin Clark is back, whether it's before the All-Star game or like probably after, it's going to take some acclimation again, right? Because Kelsey Mitchell had said this after the Commissioner's Cup. This team has already been through so much this season. Like, you're super excited about having DeWanna Bonner. Very quickly, that falls apart. Mm-hmm. You add in Aari McDonald, an incredible player, fits this system, is doing everything she can, but hasn't had a lot of time on the court with Caitlin, because when she first came in, it was because Caitlin was out. Not to mention all of these other pieces, you know, Sophie Cunningham coming in, Natasha Howard, like no minutes with Caitlin. So that kind of like ramp up period, especially if it comes at a time when they're playing, you know, New York twice in a week or whatever, that's also going to impact them in the standings. And you really can't afford too many more losses here down the stretch unless you want to cross your fingers that some other teams are going to collapse.
And they're sitting right now third in the East, seventh in the league standings, right at 500, 9-9. They're at a crossroads in the season. And I think that there is a glass half full and a glass half empty perspective that you can take to this team. And both of them are true. But on the topic of the Fever, moving on to the second quarter, you mentioned Sophie Cunningham, and she has just been making all sorts of headlines over the past couple of weeks, hasn't she? Sophie Cunningham spoke with the media after it was announced, as we mentioned in the Fast Five, and as has been widely reported over the last week, the WNBA will be adding 3 new expansion teams by 2030 in Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia. And Sophie Cunningham was asked about that and media availability about the expansion, and what she said spread like wildfire. I mean, it was all over social media. It was the headline of so many articles across so many websites, and a lot of people had very, very strong opinions about it. Now, in a nutshell, I'm not going to quote Sophie, but in a nutshell of what she said was, 1, I don't want the league to be growing too fast. Growing pains are realistic, and I think that is a fair concern about the league growing too fast, too quickly, getting a little bit too big for its britches.
Agree.
But she also questioned the markets. She was like, hey, you know, everybody loves Florida, Nashville, Kansas City has a whole lot of investment for its women's sports. She mentioned the NWSL franchise in Kansas City, which does have a ton of support from the fans and financially. She was like, I don't know of anybody who wants to go to Cleveland or Detroit. And obviously the cities of Cleveland and Detroit are feeling some type of way about that. Your thoughts on what Sophie Cunningham said? Fair, foul? Has the reaction been too much? Is it fair? Just your thoughts.
Oh, I mean...
It's fair. Yeah.
I was in that group who was talking to Sophie about expansion. And the way she put it was, you know, there are some players who aren't going to be super stoked to go to Detroit and Cleveland. And certainly, as you mentioned, like the other cities she talks about, Miami specifically, Nashville, certainly a lot of off-court potential. It's just, in her mind, more fun in those cities, more things to do, a market that as a player you want to go play for because of those off the court things. And I think that's all that she was saying about her personally and about what other players were saying. Now, the reaction was overblown because I think people misconstrued what she was saying. I mean, at no point did she say Detroit will be a bad WNBA city. But at the same time, like the cities coming out, like those government accounts coming out and kind of like clapping back to back the
literally like City of Detroit Twitter account clapping back at Sophie Cunningham.
Yeah. And Detroit and those outlets clapping back at it to support that they now have a WNBA team. That was pretty cool to watch because it wasn't that many years ago, even though we keep saying it and like, I'm sure we're all tired of talking about it, but like, it wasn't that many years ago, people would just forget that they had a WNBA team. I mean, a WNBA team would win a championship and receive nothing from their city. So that part was super cool. But I do think kind of the casual fan misunderstood that she wasn't saying like that's going to be a bad market. She was saying she didn't really think it was that exciting.
And look, I've never been to Detroit. I have been to Cleveland. Cleveland is a lovely city.
Cleveland is nice.
There are cities that don't have reputations of being like the craziest, funnest spring break spots, okay? That's just the reality of it all. I think it's a very fair point that you bring up that when people feel some type of way about something, which very much so people did, and you may have heard thunder, I'm in the middle of a storm. Stay safe out there, everybody. Stay dry. That is a good thing. When you say something that may not be the most glowing account of a city, of a place, of a team, whatever it might be, and nobody has any reaction, that's a pretty bad position to be in because people don't care. If people are mad and upset about what she is saying, that is a good thing because people care. Now, about what Sophie Cunningham said about the league growing too quickly. We talked about this on the last podcast, which of course you can find on the Yahoo Sports YouTube page, wherever you get your podcasts. That's a fair concern. Look, the WNBA right now is experiencing unprecedented levels of growth. It is fair and an honest assessment to say that that might not be the kind of growth that the WNBA experiences year over year over year. We're talking about expansion over the next 5 years until 2030. We don't know what the league investment and the CBA and the money and the TV contracts are going to look like then. So that's a fair concern by Sophie. The cities that she did bring up, she brought up Kansas City, she brought up Nashville, she brought up Miami. Look, I live in Nashville. I love Nashville. Miami's a great time. Kansas City is a great time. Those are all very fun cities. I think we're missing here, though, what the DNA is of what makes a good expansion city for the league right now. Because what all of those cities have in common, Nashville, Miami, Kansas City, they don't have NBA teams. Those are not traditional basketball markets. Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, those are rabid, not just sports markets, but basketball markets with established and successful NBA teams. What the WNBA is doing right now is making sure that it has at least a security blanket financially and by fan investment, so on and so forth, that these WNBA expansion teams will be successful because there is already a foundation in place. Now, look, I live in Nashville. I know I would love a team here. I know that there's financial investment from Candace Parker and Peyton Manning and Bill Haslam, the man that owns the Nashville Predators, that there's financial investment there, but this is not an NBA city. So to have already an NBA front office structure in place, to have an arena in place, to have a fan base that cares about basketball in place, I think that's important and something that we shouldn't look past and something that I think that we should be talking about here when we talk about WNBA expansion. And ideally, we will get to a point in this league where a WNBA team can exist independently of an NBA team. But if we're going to be really honest about where we are right now, that is just not the best decision and the best thing for this league. So I hear you, Sophie. I hear you. Miami's awesome. Miami's great this time of year. But let's create a healthy environment for a new expansion team.
That was also, that small clip of Sophie went viral, but Sophie talked for quite a few minutes. And one of the things she talked about was that all of these franchises went to NBA teams. And there's a flip side of this. You can, as you said, like support that idea, but there are definitely players and coaches and people involved in the league who don't support that idea, which is one of the things Sophie talked about. She's played for the Mercury, she's now with the Fever, and so she knows what that partnership can be, and there's certainly a benefit to that. But one of the things Cheryl Reeve talked about, and the Lynx and the Timberwolves share an ownership group as well, was that what has worked in the past in those partnerships can no longer be the game plan moving forward. Because what happens a lot, and we see this in the NCAA, is you share a sales team, but maybe the sales team is selling for the Timberwolves and throwing in the Lynx. You have a marketing team, but maybe they're not understanding or taking the time to figure out what it takes to market a W team versus how you do it for the NBA. And you're probably right. Like, maybe the W isn't at that point yet where they want to kind of like see if that'll work. And there's a lot of people saying like, maybe Portland scared them off a little bit to that. But for players who are in those environments and maybe see the backhand a little more, I do think it's a fair point for players like Sophie to say, maybe we should have looked elsewhere.
And it's fair. It is totally fair to bring that up. Totally fair. And I think that is fair to say, look, we are a league that's growing and popular, independent of the NBA or independent of any other professional league. So we should be treated as such. We don't want to be the second thought. We don't want to be, we don't have Minnesota Lynx t-shirts in a small little corner in the middle of an entire Minnesota Timberwolves pro shop. Like I totally understand that thought process. And I think we're getting there. And I think that all it takes is one market, one city, one franchise to prove like, no, we can do it this way. We can create our own blueprint with people that are passionate about this team, not the ownership groups as a whole that we have right now with the NBA and WNBA split ownership group. So all fair criticisms moving forward. But Sophie Cunningham, you know what? We appreciate you, sister. Keep letting it fly. We love you here in this program. All right. Let's get into our halftime break. And this one is a little bit sadder than normal. Halftime break is dedicated to the queen of halftimes in the WNBA and the NBA and college basketball, so on and so forth. Our beloved Red Panda. She was the halftime performer at the Commissioner's Cup at the Target Center this past week, and she fell from her 7-foot-tall unicycle. So anybody who is not familiar with Red Panda, first of all, look her up because she's incredible. She's amazing. Her whole act is she's on this very tall unicycle and she's balancing plates and bowls on her leg and on her head, and she does all of these gravity-defying types of acts. I've seen Red Panda in person a couple of times, and obviously she's all over the internet. She's all over YouTube. Never in my life, Cass, have I seen her fall, but she did fall in her halftime performance at the Commissioner's Cup from her 7-foot unicycle. She was taken off the court and severely fractured her wrist after she was taken away to the hospital after her halftime performance. She may have suffered some other injuries. That is still kind of, TBD, still has not been reported from her management group. But you were there, Cass. Mm-hmm. Scary scene.
It was kind of, as you said, like a what just happened moment, and then it went on longer and she was clearly very injured. And the arena was just like pretty silent. I think her team had said she really appreciates all the support. People just poured out love for her afterward. And I know the Fever shouted her out in their celebration in the locker room, hoping that she was okay. Very funny that Sydney Colson, though, was like, I don't think the Red Panda is watching my Instagram Live.
That was one of my favorite videos that came out from the Fever's, post-Commissioner's Cup celebration in the locker room. Caitlin Clark pops into Sydney Colson's Instagram Live like, Red Panda, if you're listening, we love you. And Sydney Colson's like, yeah, Red Panda's not watching my stuff, if we want to use the PG word that Sydney did not use. Probably true, but I hope that Red Panda is feeling the love. Like, there's not very many things that we as a country, as a society, can all agree on and galvanize together for. Red Panda is one of them. So we're sending her a very quick and speedy recovery to our queen, our beloved, sweet, sweet Red Panda. Okay, let's head into the third quarter. All-Star reserves. So the WNBA revealed the 12 reserve players for this year's All-Star game that we're coming up on in less than 2 weeks. So there'll be 3 guards, 5 front court players, and 4 players at either position. So the reserves are as follows. The Phoenix Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas, Seattle Storm guard Skylar Diggins, and Chicago Sky forward Angel Reese are the bigs. I will ask you, Cass, did Kelsey Mitchell get shafted? Should she be a starter?
I think if she were a starter, it makes absolute sense, especially when you talk about the fact, as we said, like Caitlin Clark has missed half of the season. And Kelsey Mitchell has really, I don't want to say fallen back because it's not fallen back, but she has retaken that role of making sure the Fever are scoring the ball. This is a player who was there during the very, very lean times in Indiana before Aaliyah Boston, when she was still a great player but didn't earn an all-star nod because they were just so bad. So she's definitely played like a starter, but there's so many players who could have been a starter or who could have been named reserves. There just seems to be like an up year this year. Brittany Sykes, Brianna Jones, both probably the biggest snubs that we've seen in this entire list.
Anything else that sticks out to you about some of the All-Star reserves? Obviously, we'll see Kiki Finn and Sonia Citron, rookies that are getting their first All-Star nod, and of course, Paige Becker's was named to the starting team. But anything else in terms of snubs or players that you feel like maybe didn't get their due, or maybe got a nod to the All-Star game or the All-Star lineup and maybe shouldn't have been?
I think Brittany Sykes had a very strong case to be named as a reserve on this team. And Dearica Hamby kind of called it out. She was listed on someone's list as a snub, and she said, forget about me, but the fact that there are two Mystics players who made the All-Star team, whether starter or reserve, and leading scorer Brittany Sykes is not one of them, is certainly notable. And I think for Brittany Sykes, like, she's kind of where this starts and stops. Her ability to get into the paint, to get to the bucket, to draw free throws early on in the season especially, has really opened up the game for all of this kind of rebuilding Mystics team.
Yeah, totally. So the WNBA All-Star Game will be Saturday, July 19th, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Team Collier versus Team Clark. Will Team Clark have a healthy Caitlin Clark? Now that is TBD, but All-Star Game coming up here in just a couple of weeks in Indianapolis. Let's wrap it up with the fourth quarter. Becky Hammon has been utilizing the media in her post-game press conferences to send messages to her team. This is not the first time that she's done that this season. This is not the first time that we have talked about that on this podcast. And she more recently called out her team, the Las Vegas Aces, for a 30-point loss to a Caitlin Clarkless Fever team. She called out her team, said the losing effort was trash, a complete lack of professionalism. A'ja Wilson called it embarrassing. I mean, in that game, A'ja Wilson dropped 29 and they still lost by 30. A'ja Wilson was the only ace with double-digit points. Jackie Young was the second leading scorer in that game against the Fever, and she had just 6 points. So look, embarrassing, trash, I mean, whatever word you want to use and whatever word that was used, look, it's a fair assessment. But then we saw the Aces bounce back against Connecticut. A 20-point lead over Connecticut, 18 points from Aaliyah Nye off the bench, Alyssa Smith with a double-double. How do you assess this situation with the Aces? Because I always look at teams. I'm like, hey, if you're a championship team, you got to beat championship teams. Mm-hmm. And if you're a team that can beat the bad teams but can't beat the good teams, maybe you're just not a good team. What are the Aces right now?
I think what you just said, not a good team. And we've talked about the fact that Becky Hammon keeps calling out players, which is never a good sign. I think that the Aces have really just hung their hats on A'ja Wilson being A'ja Wilson, and that's just not going to be the answer. You can never just rely on one player to do everything that you want to do, or to play through her solely to win a championship. I think the problem with the Aces has long been, for a while, I guess you could say Kia Stokes playing, in the front court was solid defensively, and you really wanted to focus on that, but having a starter contribute 1 or 2 points on average per game, it's kind of bonkers talk to think that a team like that is going to run the table and win a championship, given how much everyone else has leveled up. And I think, like, when you talk about, rebounding to beat Connecticut, like, sorry to Connecticut, but that team is a struggle bus.
It doesn't speak any sort of volumes to me when a team that's the caliber of Vegas and has a player like the caliber of A'ja Wilson can beat a team like the Sun by 20. Like, again, no disrespect to Connecticut, but that doesn't show me anything. Like, that doesn't show me that you are figuring things out, the fundamental problems that we have seen with this Aces squad. That doesn't show me that now all of a sudden they've turned a corner and they're figuring things out going into the All-Star break.
If you look at their schedule, just to put this into further context, they've played Connecticut 3 times, okay? 26-point margin, 25-point margin, 18-point margin. So that's where you're getting a lot of your margin from. They beat Los Angeles by 15, but then you have single-digit wins, and kind of like the standout is they beat Seattle by 5, beat Phoenix by 3, beat Indiana by 8, but then, you're losing to Washington and Minnesota by 14. You're getting blown out by Seattle and Indiana and Golden State. That was a really bad game.
Yeah.
I don't see them, probably making it to the semifinals if it's 2 weeks before All-Star and it's the umpteenth time your coach has called out your effort.
That's kind of the big thing to me, is it feels like the Aces keep taking one step forward and 2 steps back. That it's, you win a game, you got to wash off all of the bad that was, you start to feel yourself again, you start to feel like you're figuring things out, and then you suffer a couple of bad losses here and there. You suffer a really brutal loss, like the 30-point loss to the Fever last week, and then Becky Hammon has to call someone out or call the team out in a press conference, and then that makes headlines, and then they turn things around. It's just like this constant cycle, and at some point, if we're not already at this point already, Becky Hammon's messaging falls flat. If you keep hearing the same thing from your coach over and over again, your coach is using the same avenues to express disappointment or frustration, all of a sudden that just becomes like another week. It's habit, and it doesn't land or resonate the same way. Obviously, the Aces went under several changes this past offseason. Other teams were buying and building, and the Aces just kind of stayed the same. Is this a Becky Hammon problem more than it's a roster problem?
I think time maybe remains to be seen. I mean, they don't have a GM right now, so you always wonder what kind of conversations are going on about adding players or trades or whatever. What I will say about Becky Hammon is this is a coach who came into a team that was, on the rise and set up to just finally get over that final hump and win a championship. And kudos to everything she did during those first 2 years to win back-to-back, and then last year make it to the semifinals. But this is kind of the first stretch we've seen out of Becky Hammon, I think, where she's really, really going to have to coach and have a front office that maybe is willing to mix things up and make some changes, because Kelsey Plum leaving sounds like a Kelsey Plum decision, asking for that, that trade, sign and trade after the core designation. Bringing Joel Boyd in is great, but what else have you done?
Yeah. And when you win back-to-back championships, it's not always common that you hear a star marquee player start to look around at other options. And I think the Aces are in a position where they might feel a little bit more empowered to, take a detour and start to do things differently because they have those championships. And they still have a star in Asia Wilson, who is a, incredible tool either for a rebuild or, either you hold on to Asia Wilson as your foundation or you trade her for pieces and start, that rebuild. Not saying that is what they are going to do or if that's on the horizon, but the Aces having those championships and having pieces, real negotiating pieces, I think can aid in a rebuild moving forward. It's just a matter of, do you want to try and run it back and retool, or is it completely tear it down and rebuild? That is what I think is, left to be seen. Again, the Aces are still sitting at 500. They're 5th in the West. It's not like this team is horrific. It's not like this team is just like the laughing stock of the WNBA, and it's not like this team can't figure things out and potentially make a run in the postseason. It's just there hasn't been anything that I've seen. And maybe you have, Cass, but there hasn't been anything that I have seen enough consistency to say that this Aces team can figure it out and make a run for the postseason.
Yeah, I think also, the saying of winning masks issues a lot. Now that they're losing and losing pretty regularly at this point to be 500, to your point, what does that open up? What kind of questions? What kind of, mixing it up are they going to do? I think also, they haven't had a good first round pick, or at times any first round pick, because of some of those investigations where they've lost a pick. And so they haven't been able to bring in, a quality young player to add to this group. I think also with the CBA, negotiations and players not signing through this season, that could open up a lot of avenues for the Aces too, because for basically every team, you're looking at almost a clean canvas in terms of who you can add, who you want to add, who you're having conversations with to bring in. And certainly, to be clear, there are players who have said or maybe feel privately that they're definitely returning to the team they're on this year. They're just doing it to get more money in the CBA so they're not locked in. But certainly there's going to be a lot of star players who are maybe looking at going elsewhere, and it opens up a lot of avenues for a lot of different teams in the offseason.
This offseason is going to be insane.
Bonkers.
It's going to, dare I say, the most bonkers, bananas, off-the-wall offseason in the history of this league.
It's going to be wild. You could, if players really wanted to, you could see some truly crazy, teams, because players want to play together and teams have all this cap space to do it.
I'm so here for it. I'm not trying to rush through the season just to get to the drama that will be this offseason, but stay tuned because we're not going anywhere in the offseason because it's going to be just as juicy as the regular season. All right, Cass, she is Cassandra Negley. I am Caroline Fenton. Let's keep an eye on next week. We've got Vegas heading to New York. That is the game that you'll be at this week, correct, Cass?
Yep, I'll be at that game Tuesday. Certainly coming into the season, it was a spicy, enticing Las Vegas-New York rivalry that we know well. But with the Aces kind of sitting at 500, New York falling apart a little bit, trying to figure out how to play without Jonquel Jones, and they didn't have Leo Fibich for a while. Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
I'm with you. It doesn't quite have the same juice as it did probably a month or so ago. But, when these two teams play, it's always a fun time. That game is 7 o'clock Central Time on ESPN in New York. And you can catch all of Cass's breakdown of pregame, postgame, what's going on in the game, sports.yahoo.com. We've also got a couple of more matchups throughout the week. Minnesota is heading to Phoenix on Wednesday. Atlanta at New York this weekend. And Wings at Fever on July 13th. That's Sunday. Wings, obviously, Paige Beckers. Fever, Caitlin Clark. Are we going to get Caitlin Clark? Will we get a matchup? The first time that we'll see these two face off against each other, back-to-back first-round picks in the 24 and 25 drafts. So could we see Caitlin Clark? That is TBD, but we at least will see Paige Beckers in that matchup. So we will be back next week with a full breakdown of all of that action and all of the off-the-court news in the WNBA. So keep it right here on Yahoo Sports.